The Indian Union is above all a fiscal union, right? And if you want to trace the origin of the fiscal union, historians generally agree it's the Charter Act of 1833. And what the Charter Act of 1833 did was that it rolled the legislative powers of the governor of Madras presidency and the governor of Bombay presidency and rolled them in under the governor of Bengal presidency and elevated the governor of Bengal into what is the governor general of India, right? So as you can see, this is a little bit of a corporate restructuring under the East India Company, and that, however, shapes the world in which we live in some 2 centuries later, right? Skip to the run up to independence. The blueprint of what was to be the independent nation was the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, right? Lord Mountbatten liked it, the British colonial administration liked it, even Muhammad Ali Jinnah liked it, because what it did was that it sort of gave states and provinces fiscal sovereignty to the extreme and made them much stronger and leaving a rather weak union, right? So this was the design, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah liked it for the obvious reason that it would sort of give fiscal sovereignty, which sort of stopped short of creating an entirely new country, right? However, Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar did not like this idea, and they had their own reasons for it, which is that B.R. Ambedkar was worried that having very strong states and a weak union would result in elite capture of power at the state level, and therefore that would leave the lot of the oppressed far worse. Jawaharlal Nehru didn't like it because he wanted to use the might of the union to industrialize and therefore fight poverty, right? Reasonable motivations for both of them, but they won, and we ended up with a stronger union, weaker states, and a tax system that is skewed towards the union significantly more than it is towards the states, right? So this is kind of the world that we live in, and every year since independence, that stronger union has become even more strong, and that slightly weaker state has become weaker, right? That's because generally how power operates in a zero-sum game. Now, the sort of biggest factor in the last decade or last generation in that equation between the center and the states has been the passing of GST. What the GST did was it took away what little powers the state had in terms of imposing indirect taxes and sort of rolled them into a single GST, right? Like now no state can sort of raise new revenues in the form of indirect taxes, and they anyway did not have much powers over direct taxes, right? So given that context, what has happened since the passing of the GST is that the revenue deficits of the states, which had sort of been falling, year after year, and had reached zero in the year 2016, and that all states had essentially eliminated their, revenue deficits. If you sort of look at the passing of GST as a watershed moment, since that time they've sort of slowly crept back. You could argue that the COVID pandemic had a little bit to do with that. It certainly did. But even without that, the trend is clear in that the revenue deficits are sort of creeping back up again, right? So this is the context, and we should, and it is in this context that the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, has come up with a sort of a new report. In fact, it released it in December of 2023, right? So it's called State Finances, a Study of Budgets 2023-24, right? If you look at it, the RBI sort of acknowledges that it doesn't mention GST, but kind of sort of implies that the vertical imbalance has been attributed to the GST, right? So the vertical imbalance is a fancy way of saying the union government collects a lot more revenues than it has obligations as expenses, and therefore it has to transfer some of that revenue to states, which have much greater obligations in terms of expenditure, but have much lower ability to collect taxes, right? Because sort of the union sort of has taken away that power of the purse in terms of owning those tax sources, right? So this is the basic problem of our fiscal union, right? The union government sort of collects 2/3 of the revenue, is in charge of 1/3 of the expenditure, whereas states collect 1/3 of the revenue and are in charge of 2/3 of expenditure, right? So this is obviously unviable, and therefore the union has to collect, transfer some back to the states, and that's how our system works, right? Now, some of it is natural for most federal unions, right? Because it's natural that, for instance, if you want to take the northeast of this country, they have a low population base, they have very little industry, so to speak of, and therefore, it is natural that, some part of the more populated and prosperous parts of the country transfer some of their resources to the less populated, less industrialized parts of the country, so that there is some kind of equalization, right? And that's natural in most federal unions, right? Except what the RBI in its report suggests is something else, right? Like, if you look at it, what it says is that it looks at fiscal capacity at the state level and says that states should improve this in order to meet the increasing demands of expenditure in their books at the state level. What this means is that there are two aspects to any state's sort of budgets. One is state's own taxes, and the other is sort of transfers from the union, right? If you consider a state like Telangana, for instance, it's, the state's own taxes form about 73.2% of its overall, revenues to meet its expenditure. The remaining comes from the center, right? If you look at a state like Madhya Pradesh, what happens is that, that number is about 45%. Right? So what the RBI says in its sort of bureaucratic language of improving the fiscal capacity of the states in order to meet the vertical imbalance demands is essentially that Telangana or states like it should increase the 73.2% of states' own tax revenue as the ratio of what it means to the overall revenue expenditure. It should increase it even further. What does this mean? This means that the citizens of the state should firstly pay a lot of taxes to the union government, which after all owns all the buoyant tax sources, and then it should forego much of that transfer to Telangana, because by virtue of being a relatively prosperous state, the RBI implicitly says that it should forego that, and over and top of that, it has to increase the state level taxes in order to increase the 73.2 even higher, right? Like, so essentially what it is asking for is to tax the citizens of Telangana twice over, so that, citizens of Madhya Pradesh do not have to be taxed that much, right? Like, this is unfair in any reasonable system. And the way to address this is the way to address this vertical imbalance that the RBI has called out is simple, which is that, stop giving all the buoyant sources of revenue to the union and allow states to collect more taxes, so that we don't have to equalize this all over again, right? That is the reasonable solution. Except what the Reserve Bank of India does is the exact opposite. And this is what happens when you let bureaucrats write recommendations in cold language. And park this aside, the other thing that you need to consider is that all of this comes in the background of every single finance commission with the union, along with the union government, sort of lecturing states, saying that they are fiscally profligate and that they should look at their revenue deficits and their budgets and manage it better. Except if you compare the revenue deficit of states with that of the union, what you see is that the states have managed their budgets much better than what the union has. And this has been true for like 30, 40 years now. So it's that the union, by virtue of collecting more taxes, maintaining a worse revenue deficit, gets to lecture states on how to spend its money. And in doing so, it also gets to rename some of these taxes as cess and not share that with states, right? So it's like, it's a participant in a game, except it gets to set the rules of the game. And this is what is seriously problematic. And if we let the cold bureaucratic language of the RBI sort of come in aid of the union government to sort of dictate and lecture states, we will end up with states being glorified bureaucracies. And that is the problem that we are trying to fight. Thank you.